It's time for another book versus adaptation where I watch the adaptation, then read the book and decide which is better based on the plot, characters, and relationships. Today, we're talking about Lockwood Co, The Whispering Skull. There will be spoilers for both the book and the Netflix adaptation, so if you don't want to be spoiled, you can use the chapters down below to navigate to find out which one I liked better, or you can check out one of my other book versus adaptations here. The first thing that I noticed was that the show definitely crashes the timeline a bit. Between the first two books, there's a time period of about 6 months, whereas in the show, it leads directly from Lucy passing out after talking to the skull to the following morning when Lockwood and George are coming home from a job. Was this better for the story? I don't know, but it was a choice that made sense given that they wanted to fit 2 books into 1 season. In the books, the bet between Kipps and Lockwood doesn't really make sense. They don't give any kind of measures for success for this bet. It's just, let's prove who's going to be the best agent. How? The show then makes the bet about who solves the case of Bickerstaff first. I found that in the book, the stakes of the bet were also missing for me. It was just, let's take out an article in the London Times. Whereas in the show, not only was that a part of it, but there was also the part about having to quit.
What's the matter, Tony? Scared you'll lose?
While I did like this better, it did cause a little bit of a backslide for Lockwood's character compared to what we saw in the beginning part of the series and the first book. I personally liked that George and Lockwood didn't believe at first that Lucy could talk to Type 3 ghosts. I felt like it was a very realistic situation, especially giving it into the context of this is their job. As somebody who's in the professional sphere, I can't tell you how many times I, as a woman, have had to fight for my convictions and for things that I know that are true because unfortunately, my male colleagues are not listening to me. Or even worse, don't believe that I know what I'm talking about. I felt that this was actually more realistic given the fact that the 2 characters are faced with some very rare occurrences. Not just having a Type 3 in the house, but also coincidentally having someone that can talk to a Type 3.
Not only are you one of only 2 people in the history of the world to be able to talk to ghosts, but that we actually have a Type 3 ghost in our house.
Having some doubt there makes sense. While the immediate acceptance of George and Lockwood in the books is really sweet, it takes away a lot of the internal conflict and tension that we see in the TV show. This fight is also better paced in the TV show because the book does something weird where it's like they're fighting for a little bit and then they leave and then the ghost talk happens and they come back and then they're fighting again. It just like you're literally breaking the tension in that scene in the book. I didn't enjoy it. In the show, the tension just builds and builds and builds until Lockwood snaps, and this is a much more interesting character moment. The Fitz ball invitation arriving so early in the book was interesting to me. I thought it was an interesting nod to Penelope's letter from the first book. And it does lead back to a fun reveal as the characters are planning that, oh, we have this thing that we could utilize for this plan. The invitation seemed like a fairly insignificant detail in the book until that moment, and that was fun. In contrast, the invitation is introduced in the show right at the moment when it is needed, which is convenient but lacks that fun realization. One of the things I really didn't enjoy in the book was that there was a significant amount of info dumping in the backstory for Bickerstaff. This is a problem I had in the Screaming Staircase too. I felt like when it came to the details and the mystery of the jobs that they were facing, the information for these jobs was just handed to them in the books. Whereas in the show, they have to discover the answers to these mysteries, usually with the help of George's research skills, which I'll talk about more when I talk about George later. I'm a bit torn about how the initial Bickerstaff job went in the books and the show. I definitely found it really interesting that they're mentioning how different Bickerstaff's ghost is from other ghosts in the book, and also I found Bickerstaff's ghost in the book more intimidating and scarier. However, I hated that George just kind of admitted that he saw the mirror and felt weird about it. It completely took any of the mystery out of the story. That being said, I was really interested in this idea of why was Bickerstaff's ghost so different, and it was infuriating to me because I felt like I didn't get an answer to that question by the end of the book. Is that going to be answered in later books? Maybe. And I also felt like the Bickerstaff stuff in both the book and the show are leading towards future elements of maybe they're the origin story for this harp symbol organization that we've seen hints of. I actually have this theory that that harp symbol organization is somehow tied to the mythology of Orpheus. I don't really have a basis for it other than the harp, but like in my head I'm going, were the original three like ghost hunters like Fitz and Rotwell, and I forget the name of the third one, but were they initially like trying to mess with the underworld using Bickerstaff's research and like somehow ended up causing the problem? I would find that really interesting. That being said, please don't tell me if I'm right or wrong in this theory because I don't want to be spoiled. I both did and did not like the visit to the antique shop in the book. I thought it was probably honestly better developed than what we saw in the show, but I didn't really feel like there was any sense of danger. It just felt really juvenile. Whereas in the show, it felt like there was a real sense of danger and like they were facing something that someone would really face if they were messing with a bigwig in the black market. The electric chair was kind of a nice nod to the electric traps in the book, but at the end of the day, how Lucy and Lockwood got out of that situation in the show just made absolutely zero sense. The scenes at Bickerstaff's mansion are vastly different between the show and the book, and I'm honestly kind of torn about both. I hated the bickering among the team in the book about who was entering the house first. It just, again, was juvenile. Instead, you have the Skull trying to manipulate Lucy into letting Lockwood and George go into the house because if they die, it doesn't matter because the Skull can't talk to them.
Let Lockwood and Kareem go.
Why?
Because they can't talk to me, and you can. They're expendable.
That being said, I don't think that Sho, Lockwood, or George would have let Lucy go into that house by herself. Then there were some really great moments in the book that were terrifying. For example, the scene where Lucy's in a dark room and she feels George and Lockwood at her back, but then realizes that it wasn't them. I'm not really sure why they changed the Bickerstaff Mansion scene so much between the show and the book. I feel like there are two possible reasons. The first is that in the show, George being influenced by the mirror is kind of a big reveal to Lucy and Lockwood, and the way the book had it would have spoiled this moment. And the second is I think they wanted to make Kipps's team feel more like frenemies rather than just straight up enemies because they're fighting all over the house in the book. There is this sense in the show that even though they don't get along, they're on the same side because they're all agents. And I definitely liked the show better in that respect. The ball plays out so much better in the show for so many reasons. There's Penelope trying to poach Lucy away from Lockwood Co. There's the introduction of maybe a love triangle, even if it is a little bit weird. And Lockwood having to talk to Lucy about his abandonment issues when he realizes that Kipps has talked to her about leaving Lockwood Co. I also preferred the auction scene in the show versus the book. The stakes, again, just felt higher in that they're dealing with these really dangerous people. And people die when you mess with these people. And the fact that they had to use ghosts just to escape with their lives was so interesting. Not only that, but it finally makes Lockwood realize that there are consequences to his actions that maybe won't influence him directly, but that can get people killed. In the book, they just escape out the window. There's no emotional stakes there. It was a huge reveal in the show that one of the servants, which I think was the skull, was able to talk to spirits when they were alive. Like, is that why the skull is a type 3? Because they could talk to ghosts? Does that mean all dead agents come back as type 3 ghosts and we just don't meet them? Like, what does this mean? It's a huge reveal and really interesting given the fact that the Biggerstaff storyline is happening well before the problem even happens. Now, that being said, historically there are records of clairvoyants or mediums, whether or not you believe in that sort of thing, so maybe it's not as big of a deal as I thought it was, but it felt really big when I read that. I found it interesting that they kept Dulac's journal in the story, but the information that the journal gives them is really, really different. Like, the journal in the show definitely becomes much more of a way to know that the bone glass is influencing your mind, and leads to the reveal for Lucy and Lockwood that George has been influenced by the mirror. I also liked how the final conflict played out better in the show. It was just more dynamic and interesting. It brought up a lot of questions like, what did the ghost see in the mirror? Like, how is this gonna play into future seasons of the show, if we get future seasons? So I obviously had a lot to say about the differences in plot between the show and the book for this one, but at the end of the day, I think while the show is not as well developed in some aspects, that I still need to give the point to it. While certain plot threads I think were probably better thought out than the show, at the end of the day, they just came off as very, very juvenile and lacking any sort of emotional depth. We don't see Barnes a lot in the later half of the first season of Lockwood Co, but we do start to see that he is becoming that begrudging ally that we get more in the books. Almost as if their solving of Coombe Hall kind of earned his respect. This points to some of the character growth I'm hoping to see with Barnes that I mentioned in my last video. That being said, his depiction is pretty similar between the book and the show for this part, so I'm giving the point to the book. The Winkmans are pretty terrifying in the show, especially Mrs. Winkman. Like, that woman is not right. And what was up with Leopold? I couldn't tell if I was supposed to feel sorry for him or if he was just playing like a weirdly depicted creepy child. Maybe both? I don't know. But I definitely was feeling something towards him as opposed to like he was just a little brat in the books, and that was it. Mr. Winkman in the show gives off like serious Irish mob boss vibes in the show, and I was digging it. He comes off as very cartoonish in the book, which is a problem that I'm having with the villains in Lockwood Co. in general. I don't know if it's just that they're written for a younger target audience, but there's zero nuance to a lot of the villains in the books. Kipps's crew in the books are just like little jerks. There's nothing really likable about them at all, whereas I actually started to really like Kipps's crew by the end of the season. While Lockwood and Kipps's crew did end up working together at the end of the book, like they did in the season, this is where I think the book struggles with the first-person perspective because we didn't see any of that. And that was actually something really fun to watch in the show. I loved the side plot that they added with Kipps in the show. I think they say in the first book that Kipps is in like his early 20s, which holds true for the show, but what the book doesn't really say is like, is Kipps talented or not? Like, he could just be an adult supervisor. And if that's the case, I don't really like the very immature vibes that Kipps gives off in the book. Kipps in the show is still a bit of a jerk, especially to Lockwood, but it doesn't come from a place of immaturity. And I really liked this aspect of getting to explore what happens when an agent's talents start to fail.
You don't know what it's like when your talent starts to fade.
Let me just say that I loved that they made Joplin a woman in the show. I thought it was kind of a brilliant move because you really get to see how Joplin's meek attitude comes from constantly being berated by her colleagues at work. Also, her being a woman creates some interesting dynamics and relationships, which I'll talk about later. I was able to engage with Joplin in a way that I wasn't able to engage with the Joplin in the books. Flo is very eccentric in the show. However, her eccentricities seem to be coming from a place of, one, trauma, and two, kind of sticking it to the establishment. This is a pretty far cry from the kind of bag lady characterization we get in the book. It's a really not great stigmatization of someone who is homeless. Needless to say, I think the adaptation gets the point here. I feel like I said a lot of what I needed to say about George in my previous video. However, I will say that I definitely prefer how George's arc in this book plays out in the show better. In the book, George just kind of takes Lockwood's beratement and consternation, whereas in the show, George fights back and is like, that's not fair, because it's not. Plus, you have this addition of seeing how far George will go in the pursuit of knowledge. I feel like Lucy in the show is a lot more confident than Lucy in the books. I do feel like the books are doing a good job in kind of trying to relate to young girls who feel kind of weird in their own skin and like they're never attractive enough. However, that really negative internal monologue, while identifiable, is not necessarily the greatest role model for girls of that age. We should be encouraging young girls to be confident in their skin, no matter what they look like. And that's something I feel like the show did a lot better than the book. Though the show does have this line,
Can't stand the mirrors, so always a stupid girl staring back at me.
However, I don't necessarily feel like she's talking about her appearance here, other than that it's her reflection. I almost feel like she's dealing with more of the internal conflict that she's having to face. And I feel like it plays into these very deep themes of teenage mental health in the show. I am conflicted about a lot of things between the show and the book, apparently, and Lockwood is one of them. I definitely feel like the show has a more nuanced and complex depiction of Lockwood. They essentially walk back a lot of Lockwood's character development between the first half of the TV show and the later half of the TV show, to where he's, again, making unilateral decisions without consulting the rest of the group, and I think it is pulling into how triggered Lockwood gets from Kipps. Like, in the show, there's obviously some sort of conflict that happened in the past between them, and I don't get the impression that that has happened in the book. It just seems like they don't like each other in the book. These unilateral decisions really walk back his character development in a way that I didn't particularly enjoy. Whereas the Lockwood in the book, he always has this kind of shiny veneer. And I don't know if that's just because we're seeing him through Lucy's eyes. Now, I will say I was picking up on some things in the book where that veneer was starting to crack. Like, the elements were there for that, and I appreciated that. I just didn't feel like it was very subtle or nuanced. Also, a lot of the times I feel like Lockwood in the books is just mean. Like, they flat out bully this poor kid in the graveyard. Even if the kid is a little bit of a shit, you shouldn't, like, terrorize him. I'm actually really glad they cut that scene out of the show. And while he does snap at George in the show a few times, it doesn't come off quite as mean-spirited. So I'm gonna give the point to Lockwood in the show, because while Lockwood in the show is not a perfect person, he isn't mean. Kipps asking Lucy out kind of came out of left field for me. In the show, I distinctly read it more as he was trying to poach her from Lockwood Co. to move over to Fitz. But there definitely were romantic undertones there, especially when he gets all awkward about her feeling awkward and then being like, oh, well, I guess I went too big with, going to the ball. But, at the same time, I feel like he was just asking her to coffee to talk to her about a job opportunity, and they both kind of misread that situation. And Lucy's just like really uncomfortable refusal of the coffee date was very relatable, and I enjoyed that. That scene actually really helped endear me to Kipps. It doesn't in the book because Lucy is so repulsed by the invite that you don't see anything other than that. For Kipps and Lockwood, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I don't have a ton to say here because it's not very well developed, but the bet between them is obviously some culmination of past experiences with them, and we've gotten hints of that throughout the show, but it's not been explored. But it is intriguing, like, what happened? Why does Kipps hate Lockwood? Why does Lockwood hate Kipps? Like, what was going on there? And I found that interesting and much more nuanced than what we get in the book, which is basically just Lockwood doesn't like Kipps because Kipps is a jerk. I'm finding anything with George kind of difficult to compare because I feel like George in the show is going to win everything for me. And his relationship with Lucy in particular is where he'll win every single time, because in the books, George and Lucy just don't get along ever. Whereas I feel like they are true allies and in some ways the kind of stabilizing force behind Lockwood. They have some of the most touching scenes at the end of the first season. So this relationship is probably the most interesting between the book and the show because they changed Joplin's gender. Joplin in the books is male and also a bit younger, so honestly their friendship didn't really register that much for me in the books. It only really became important until it was important to the plot. In contrast, you initially really like George and Joplin in the show because it feels like this kind of meeting of two similarly intellectually minded people who like talking about knowledge. And while that holds true throughout the rest of the season, there's also some issues here. And it starts when Joplin invites George over to her house. Like, I realize based on the fact that George is supposed to be, I think, like a year or two older than Lucy, that he is technically a legal adult in the show, but still, Joplin and George, it comes off as kind of like creepy in the show once she invites him to dinner. And this is coming from somebody who had adult friends in high school. Now, granted, they were friends that were not my preferred gender and people that I actively looked up to as kind of like a surrogate parent figure. Not that I don't have parents, I have great parents, but it was a parent figure that I had common interests with as far as hobbies were concerned. This was not that. It came off pretty groomy, and when I watched the show again with my roommate, she picked up on the same thing almost right away. It keeps the viewer on their toes, but it's definitely disconcerting. Because of this, I'm giving the point to the book, even though it's not as well developed. The relationship between George and Lockwood is kind of the cornerstone of The Whispering Skull, but it's not in the way you would expect. The cornerstone is that Lockwood is constantly undervaluing George throughout the entire book. And this comes out through fights between them and mean words and comments that Lockwood says about George. These fights do happen in the show, but it comes off more like Lockwood is reacting to a trigger instead of just Lockwood feeling disdain towards George. So this is actually a difficult comparison to make between the book and the show. In the book, it's pretty obvious that Lucy has started to develop feelings for Lockwood. However, these feelings come off as almost completely one-sided, other than a brief passing comment that Lockwood says about how nice she looks in her dress for the ball, and the fact that he gives her the necklace. However, him giving her the necklace feels like an afterthought, whereas in the show, it feels like he's giving her something very important. I also really liked how when he sees her in her dress, he actually doesn't say anything. One, because that's not really right for an employer to do to their colleague, though that opens up a whole other can of worms that we're not going to talk about because I do ship them. But you can see on his face that he does appreciate how nice she looks. You can feel how scared Lockwood is of losing Lucy to Kipps and or Fitz. And I think he reacts interestingly to this, given the fact that he has this internal conflict of, I don't want to leave anybody behind. Their relationship in the show is complex and nuanced, and I appreciate it so much that while Lucy obviously has this admiration growing for him, she doesn't take any shit from him. I also really appreciate that in the show, Lockwood is mature enough to know when he's made a mistake and also mature enough to apologize when he does. The show is actually representing really healthy levels of communication that we need to see in more teen romance content. I mentioned in my last video how much I love the found family of Lockwood Co. In The Screaming Staircase, we watch them become a cohesive unit. However, no relationship is ever all sunshine and rainbows. There can be some pretty low valleys too, and that's what happens in The Whispering Skull. While this theme is universal between the book and the show, it plays out better in the show. The conflict in the book, as I've mentioned earlier, basically comes from Lucy and Lockwood treating George as a second-rate team member, which, to be honest, he kind of is in the book. George is so much more important to the team in the show. His skills are highlighted and needed. However, he does end up getting left behind a lot, not so much from disdain, but more just being inconsiderate from Lucy and Lockwood. So George spiraling about how they don't really need him and going off and doing his own thing makes more sense in the show. And then Lucy's tearful admission about how much they need him and the fact that she has hurt him, that realization, bringing her to tears is just so touching. Because I feel like we've all done something that we didn't realize was inconsiderate and hurt someone else. And that care is what was missing from the book for me. Okay, so for me, the show is obviously the winner here. I have to admit that while the first book was a 4-star read for me, this one was more of a 3-star. I still liked it, but the things that I was most intrigued by end up getting dropped and not resolved. The book as a whole was pretty weak and on top of it kind of mean, whereas the show depicts nuanced situations with complex characters and also a healthy dose of kindness and compassion. If you liked this video but haven't seen part 1, you can watch it here. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings.